The film adaptation of the blockbuster psychological thriller, The Housemaid, is, well, it's maybe the most divisive movie of the year.
Oh, for sure. On one side, you have this furious, loyal army of book fans.
And when they saw the film, they basically declared it a complete failure, a wonky mess.
Right, which led to that viral scream, Hollywood butchered the housemaid.
Exactly. And yet, if you step away from all that fan discourse, you see critics and viewers calling it the trashy thriller of the year.
And they mean that as a compliment. They're celebrating the exact same film. The polarization isn't just like a small disagreement, it's a fundamental split.
But here's the part that actually blew my mind. This is the core contradiction we have to unpack today.
Go on.
The author herself, Freida McFadden, the person who wrote the book, The Supposed Perfect Blueprint,
Yeah.
she confessed that she almost prefers the movie to her own work.
And that just sets up the whole mission for this deep dive, doesn't it? How do you take a story that readers loved for its tight suspense, change core elements so drastically they cause fan outrage, turn it into this polarizing mess of camp and chaos, and then somehow get the creator's absolute blessing?
Today, we're going way beyond just simple reviews. Our mission is to understand why this adaptation created such intense emotional conflict between, sticking to the book and just going for maximum cinematic thrills.
It's all about expectations versus execution. We're looking at the community arguments, the casting fights, the battle overtone.
And that controversial climax that just fractured the audience. Let's get into this adaptation chaos.
Let's do it.
Okay, let's start where the emotional temperature is just absolutely boiling. The rage from the book readers.
Yeah, that's the loudest voice in the room for sure.
The biggest source of anger is all about adaptation fidelity, or, frankly, the stunning lack of it. Specifically, how they just omitted or minimized key characters.
And that frustration is completely understandable. I mean, in a tightly wound thriller like The Housemaid, every single character serves a purpose, a mechanical function. So readers on every forum were just expressing this real dismay, arguing that the screenplay basically just cherry-picked the sensational scenes without bothering to include the connective tissue that actually made those scenes make sense.
And the one character that became the lightning rod for all of this frustration, the one structural failure everyone points to, is Enzo.
Enzo, yep.
For anyone who hasn't read the novel, Enzo is not just some side character. He's absolutely crucial to the book's suspense. He provides all this critical context.
He really is the invisible tension that holds the story together. In the book, he serves a few critical functions. First, he's the external eye.
Okay.
He's someone who sees the toxicity of the Winchester household from the outside, which validates what Millie is seeing and feeling.
So he confirms she's not crazy.
Exactly. And second, and this is the most important part, he is the key informational bridge. He links Millie's past as a survivor to the trauma that Nina, the wife, and Antonia, their daughter, have experienced.
But here's where it gets really interesting. In the film, the sources all point out he is briefly name-dropped with no meaning attached.
It's a throwaway line. You could cut him entirely from the film, and the plot, as it's shown on screen, wouldn't change at all.
Which is a massive, massive difference in the book, where if you take Enzo out, the entire second act just collapses.
And this isn't just, minor fan nitpicking. This is a deep structural critique. When you're adapting a mystery or a thriller, that structure is your blueprint.
Absolutely.
The book used Enzo to layer the suspense. He was the reason the audience starts questioning the husband, Andrew, long before the big reveal. He introduced all that suspicion and historical context for the abuse.
Exactly. Enzo's disappearance mattered so much because his role was huge in providing backstory, especially for Antonia's subplot.
Right. Antonia, the troubled daughter, she's carrying this immense trauma.
And in the book, Enzo provides the background to understand why she's acting out and how it all connects to the cycle of abuse in that house.
By minimizing him, readers felt the film just eliminated that crucial connective tissue needed to make the plot flow, especially when it comes to Antonia's sudden shifts in behavior.
The film, it tries to talk about gaslighting and manipulation, but when Antonia's behavior just pivots wildly without the foundation Enzo provided,
the audience is just left confused. Or worse, they dismiss her behavior as just like poorly written melodrama instead of the calculated product of trauma that it is in the book.
This is such a classic adaptation trap.
Yeah.
It's called narrative economy. The studio probably thought, we need to hit these plot points faster. Enzo slows us down. Cut him.
And they sacrificed complexity for pacing, but in a psychological thriller, the complexity is the pacing. That's the whole point.
So what's the structural cost of that decision?
It's immense. For fans who loved the book's depth, it felt like the film gutted important backstory and just flattened the whole story.
They were promised a psychological thriller, and they got a thriller that was kind of missing its psychology.
Right, a series of events without the proper causal links. And that reduction in depth is what set the stage for the ending to just completely fail to land for those purists.
If you haven't laid the groundwork through characters who establish this cycle of abuse, the big reveals at the end just feel totally unearned.
Or, as critics noted, they felt ridiculous and poorly written. It shifted the entire genre from this methodical suspense where all the little details matter,
Toward pure, unadulterated, kind of chaotic melodrama, where the details are optional.
which explains that universal complaint you see on all the reader forums. WTF Hollywood, all you have to do is film the darn thing.
They felt like they were handed this perfect blueprint, and the producers just actively chose to deviate.
Which really highlights a crucial debate about what the intent of an adaptation should be. Was it to faithfully capture the book's essence?
Or was it to just strip the novel down to its most shocking parts, to maximize the shock for a new audience who wouldn't even notice what was missing?
The reaction really confirms that for the core readers, that approach felt like a genuine betrayal.
Okay, so building on that structural failure, let's turn to the human element, the performances.
Right.
The polarization here centered so heavily on the casting. A viewer's acceptance of the movie pretty much hinged entirely on their reaction to the actors, specifically the disparity between the two leading women.
That makes sense. The success of any story about deception and manipulation relies so heavily on the audience buying into the emotional core of the protagonist.
If you don't connect with Millie as she's, navigating the abuse and plotting her revenge,
The movie just becomes a series of outlandish events. It's not a thrilling character study anymore.
let's start with the consensus champion, Amanda Seyfried. Her portrayal of Nina, the mistress of the house, was almost universally praised.
Yeah, reviewers noted she approached the role with terrific gusto, especially in the film's most outrageous scenes. She just embraced the absurdity of it all.
Even the really skeptical critics, the ones who hated the film's overall tone, they couldn't deny her. They called her amazing and said she was the film's only unqualified success.
Seyfried seemed to get exactly what kind of movie she was in. She knew it was this gloriously campy, over-the-top melodrama, and she delivered a performance that matched that energy perfectly.
And wait, this is where the controversy begins. Seyfried is so consistently praised for stealing the show that it raised questions about the protagonist's hold on the narrative.
Right. If the supporting, often antagonistic character is getting all the praise for embracing the camp, what does that say about the lead actress who's supposed to be carrying the emotional weight of the story?
This disparity brings us right to the contentious reaction to Sydney Sweeney as Millie. This is a critical pivot point for the whole polarization debate.
It really is. The audience was split right down the middle on whether her portrayal worked.
The criticism was sharp, especially from people who loved the book's tone. Many viewers felt she was either miscast or underdirected.
Lacking the necessary craziness or raw intensity needed for such a wild, twisty story.
Yeah, one review I saw noted she seemed not fully realizing the movie she is in, suggesting she was like playing a serious drama character in the middle of a flamboyant genre film.
And when critics flat out label a major star's performance as poor casting, that generates a lot of negative discourse.
For the film to work, you have to believe in Millie's journey, her naivety, her vulnerability, and then eventually her capacity for calculated revenge.
If the performance is seen as flat or too restrained, the viewer just doesn't get that necessary emotional investment, and the whole revenge fantasy just collapses.
But there's a vigorous defense of her performance too, often from her dedicated fans and people who just loved the film's trashy tone.
Their argument was that her approach was a subtle approach to a naive character, suggesting her performance was intentionally internalized.
A slow burn, basically.
Yeah, a slow burn that required restraint until that final explosion at the end. And this is the core artistic disagreement.
Is the character supposed to be subtle and internal, reflecting the psychological horror of being gaslit?
Or should she be visibly vibrant and dramatic to match the high camp exterior that the film ultimately settled on?
The director seemed to be aiming for high camp, but Sweeney's performance often felt grounded in a much more serious, internalized drama. It created this palpable lack of sync between the two leads.
And here's where the earlier structural failures like cutting Enzo connect directly to this performance divide.
Right.
In the book, Enzo provided the backstory that explained Millie's motivations, her vulnerabilities, the depth of her trauma. By cutting that context, the actor is forced to convey all of that depth purely through performance.
Which is a huge, maybe impossible task in a fast-paced thriller.
Absolutely. The lack of structural support meant Sweeney had to sell both the initial naivety and the eventual calculating mind without the narrative scaffolding to justify that transition.
So the audience who felt she was under-directed were probably just sensing that vacuum of context.
The emotional core failed because the blueprint was broken, and the actor was left to fill in all these narrative gaps alone.
And that failure makes the contrast with Seyfried even more striking. Seyfried's character, Nina, she benefited from the film leaning into melodrama. She was allowed to be outrageous from the start.
Whereas Millie's character demanded a much more complex transition, one the script just didn't earn.
It's all captured in that viral debate title we saw, Sydney Sweeney, Miscast or Masterstroke.
The contrast is key. Seyfried embraced the spectacle, delivering what the film wanted to be, a trashy, over-the-top ride. If the protagonist doesn't match that energy, your attention shifts, and the whole main storyline just weakens.
So this inability to synchronize the performances brings us directly to the next and maybe most defining point of friction, the film's overall tone.
Yeah, the intense polarization really stems from its refusal to just settle on a clear genre. It's walking this perpetually unsteady line between high cam and serious psychological suspense.
The sources are overwhelmingly clear about the film's specific vibe. It's described as deliberately over the top.
With a distinct 90s-esque erotic thriller vibe full of sleaze and melodrama. I mean, that is a massive signal to the audience.
It's basically telling you, prepare for something glossy, morally ambiguous, and highly stylized.
We should probably take a second to define what that actually means. What is the appeal of the 90s erotic thriller or high cam in this context?
Good idea.
High cam in film is when the execution is so exaggerated, so knowingly artificial, that it transcends just being in bad taste and becomes this delightful, deliberate performance.
Think glossy visuals over realistic stakes.
Exactly, and heightened moral ambiguity, characters whose internal lives are expressed through sheer dramatic volume. The 90s thriller aesthetic specifically leans on sleek, expensive locations, questionable fashion.
And a plot driven entirely by sex and suspicion. It's pure pulp.
Pure pulp, maximized. And that aesthetic choice is exactly where the audience splits.
The enthusiasts absolutely adored this approach. They praised the sleazy and over-the-top style, calling it outrageously enjoyable.
A guilty pleasure that isn't high art, but a fun time. They basically checked their intellectual expectations at the door and just strapped in for the ride.
But the conflict comes when you overlay those expectations with the ones from the source material. Readers and viewers who wanted a serious, grounded thriller.
Something like Gone Girl or The Woman in the Window.
Exactly. They found the melodrama too silly or just hopelessly inconsistent in tone. The cinematic language was speaking 1990s schlock, while the psychological source material promised this tightly plotted, character-driven suspense.
This tonal ambiguity even led to these vigorous debates in genre-specific forums. You can see the argument playing out in horror communities.
Does the Housemaid adaptation even count as horror or serious suspense?
The argument against it being traditional horror centered on it being a psychological thriller and the absence of overt scares. It wasn't designed to make you jump.
Yeah, one user claimed, pretty definitively, not one aspect of this movie is meant to scare. It's a movie designed to shock you with reveals, but not to frighten you in a visceral way.
On the other hand, some people argued it is horrific in a broader psychological sense. The horror of manipulation, of gaslighting, of domestic abuse.
Which is the inherent thematic conflict created by this polarizing tone. How do you deal with serious trauma within a deliberately trashy framework?
And that leads us to the critical idea of the thematic cost. The sources note that the glossy, pulpy style may have undermined the seriousness of key themes like gaslighting and abuse for a big chunk of the audience.
If the delivery is pure camp, does the difficult, crucial message about surviving abuse actually land effectively?
That is a tough question, and it really divides the audience along ethical and aesthetic lines. Was the film treating these serious issues as just plot devices?
Sensationalized mechanisms for maximum entertainment.
Or, as the counter-argument went, did the pulpy style simply make the ride more entertaining, letting the audience engage with difficult topics through the satisfying lens of a stylized revenge fantasy?
It's the difference between exploitation using abuse for shock value and empowerment, where the victim gets this spectacular, triumphant revenge.
And for those who prioritized thematic gravity and realism, the film's style was a failure. It minimized the pain. But for those prioritizing trashy fun and the satisfaction of spectacle, the heightened reality was a wild success.
The film's aesthetic choices, the bright colors, the dramatic score, the over-the-top wardrobe, it all contributes to this polarizing effect.
It deliberately avoids the gritty realism that you see in a lot of modern domestic thrillers, and it forces you to constantly decide if you're watching serious commentary or a glorified soap opera.
And that ambiguity, that willful refusal to commit to a serious tone, is the ultimate driver of this deep polarization.
It ensures that no single group owns the interpretation, which leads to those highly contradictory yet equally passionate reviews. The film demands you either accept its camp boundaries or reject it entirely.
Okay, we've established the book. Fans were furious about fidelity, the audience was split on casting, and the critics were at war over the tone.
Right.
Now we move to the final arena of conflict. The plot twists, especially that wild third act, which drove the discussion and for many readers was the ultimate cinematic betrayal.
If the first two-thirds of the film were polarizing, the third act was just pure, unadulterated chaos, structurally and narratively.
This is where the film took the book's tight blueprint and just completely threw it out the window.
Yeah, they substituted nuance for maximum cinematic impact. We need to talk about the concept of third act fatigue here.
Let's start with the pacing. Regardless of whether viewers liked the twists or not, most agreed the movie started strong but suffered from severe third act fatigue.
It's a syndrome where the audience has just endured too many reveals, and instead of being thrilled by the final ones, they're just exhausted.
The main complaint was that the ending felt profoundly overstuffed. The film tried to cram in way too many narrative threads and character motivations.
And it just lost all momentum in that critical final stretch. One review I saw quipped brilliantly that the third act feels like it's 8 hours long.
When a viewer feels exhausted by the twists instead of thrilled by them, that's a definitive pacing failure.
And yet at the same time, for the camp enthusiasts and those who came in expecting total absurdity, the twists were an absolute highlight.
They called them tastily over the top and genuinely exciting. This is the twist divide.
Was the film brilliantly unpredictable, or did it just try too hard, tacking in one twist too many, and collapse under its own weight?
The viewer's personal tolerance for absurdity really defines this experience.
Those who called it a thrilling roller coaster were willing to suspend disbelief entirely for the sake of entertainment. But those who expected realism found the final revelations ridiculous and poorly written.
Precisely because they lacked the careful contextual buildup the novel had provided, the context that, for example, Enzo had established earlier.
Exactly. And this brings us to the major point of divergence, the core betrayal for the purists. The bloody alteration in the climax itself.
The film took the novel's controlled resolution and just dramatically escalated both the stakes and the violence.
Yeah.
It traded sophistication for spectacle.
In the book, the sources tell us, Millie's triumph over Andrew unfolded in this tight, thrilling sequence. And importantly, it retains some of that dark, satisfying humor that was part of her revenge.
It was nuanced. It fit the tight psychological thriller mold, focusing on entrapment and legal consequences rather than just blunt violence.
Wait, it gets even crazier because the movie opted for something entirely different. The film went for a more graphic confrontation and a significantly altered resolution involving Andrew's entire family.
The victory was far more visceral, far more final, and way less psychological.
The crucial shift was away from psychological entrapment and toward physical, bloody spectacle. A vocal Reddit critic lamented that the movie threw away the book's neat climax and dark humor for a generic bloody rout.
And that's the core complaint of the fidelity camp. The film chased a blockbuster moment, not narrative sophistication. It led to the critique that bigger does not mean better.
The film's ending almost became a critique of commercial filmmaking itself. It seemed to suggest that modern audiences won't settle for a psychological victory.
They demand a visible, high-stakes, bloody confrontation to feel satisfied.
And this is the moment we loop all the way back to that initial shocking contradiction. Despite this explosion of fan rage, despite critics saying the ending was ridiculous and poorly written,
Freida McFadden, the original author, had her shocking admission.
she shockingly admitted she almost prefers the movie to her own book, appreciating the film's fresh spin.
I mean, that's not just an endorsement. It's a structural defense of the adaptation's creative choices.
So what does that admission tell us? It confirms the core split in reception, not just between readers and non-readers, but between the literary experience and the cinematic one.
McFadden likely recognized that the very elements readers treasured, the subtle buildup, the internal tension, the detailed connective tissue,
Are often liabilities on screen when your goal is a fast-paced, visceral thriller for a mass audience.
she enjoyed the film's darker cinematic divergence, arguing it delivered thrills the novel because of its literary constraints just couldn't match.
Which reinforces the idea that the film's goal was never fidelity. Its goal was the maximization of cinematic spectacle and maximizing sharp value for a new, broader audience.
It completely complicates the adaptation betrayal narrative.
Right. When the creator says, "I liked the betrayal," it forces the audience to rethink their definition of ownership and success in adaptation.
It suggests that a successful adaptation might be one that honors the spirit of the story by translating its core thrills, even if that means jettisoning the original structure and embracing a campier tone.
It's the author giving permission to just enjoy the chaos. And that permission shifts the entire debate from bad adaptation to divergent success, which is an incredibly rare thing to see.
So if we synthesize this entire chaotic deep dive, we can boil down the core reasons for this extreme polarization into three central, inescapable conflicts.
Conflict number one, the expectation mismatch. Audiences came in wanting a serious, grounded psychological thriller or a perfectly faithful adaptation.
And instead, they received high camp, a 90s erotic thriller vibe, and a deliberate refusal to stick to the novel's structure.
The viewer's choice to either accept or reject that camp determined their entire enjoyment.
Conflict number two, the characterization failure. The whole film hinges on the audience connecting with Millie's journey.
And if viewers didn't buy into Sydney Sweeney's performance, which was already complicated by removing backstory like Enzo, the entire emotional arc of abuse and revenge just failed to land.
And that was magnified by the contrast with Amanda Seyfried's universally praised, show-stealing embrace of the melodrama.
And conflict number three, adaptation betrayal versus cinematic maximization.
Readers felt profoundly disappointed by what was changed. Gutting the backstory, shifting from nuanced dark humor to a generic bloody spectacle in the climax. That fueled all the negative word of mouth.
But conversely, newcomers, or those who enjoyed the maximalist approach, including the author herself, celebrated the film on its own merits as a slick, sexy thriller that prioritized entertainment over literary precision.
The intensity of this conversation is captured perfectly in the quotes we found. This wasn't subtle disagreement, it was emotional warfare.
Yeah, it really highlights how personally invested people become in their favorite stories.
You had the frustrated reader camp, represented by that hyperbolic cry, the book was 1,000 better. They felt duped.
They argued the studio had a guaranteed success and just messed it up for no reason.
And then you had the enthusiastic camp, who just reveled in the sheer outrageousness, captured by titles like campy, crazy, and worth every minute.
They celebrated the sleazy and over-the-top style as a necessary, guilty pleasure that delivered on pure, unadulterated thrills.
This dynamic with viewers directly contradicting each other, one side calling it trash and the other calling it the best trash ever, shows how personal expectation really defines enjoyment.
And how a film can be both a critical failure in fidelity and a commercial success in spectacle at the same time.
And this brings us to the final provocative thought. We noted that the film, despite its glossy, pulpy presentation, explicitly touched on very serious dark issues: domestic abuse, gaslighting, power dynamics.
Right. So given its glossy, over-the-top, 90s-esque presentation, you have to ask, did this adaptation ultimately handle these serious topics responsibly?
You can look at it through two critical lenses. First, the slickness glamour test. Does the film's polished, high-camp aesthetic distract so effectively from the reality of Millie's pain that it feels exploitative?
Or conversely, does it pass the revenge fantasy test? Does that satisfying over-the-top conclusion, the victim's spectacular dismantling of her abuser, outweigh the thematic costs by providing a genuinely empowering, cathartic release for the audience, even if it sacrifices realism?
It's a question that really defines whether you walked away entertained or genuinely conflicted.
And that tension between the pursuit of maximum entertainment and the responsibility to the underlying themes of survival is exactly what makes this adaptation so endlessly fascinating and necessary to analyze.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the adaptation chaos surrounding The Housemaid. We hope this conversation gives you the vocabulary and context to understand why this film caused such a cultural stir.
Whether you prefer the tight character-driven suspense of the novel or the bloody maximalist spectacle of the film, the sheer intensity of the reaction proves that adaptation, when it's done controversially, becomes its own compelling story.
So what do you think? Have you watched the movie?